Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Let's Build series. No, this isn't a tutorial series. This is a series where I walk you through my process of building an asset from start to finish. We'll be continuing our series with Mina and picking up where we last left off. We had finished the model, set up the UVs, texture painted it in full, and laid out the base form rig to begin building our full one upon. And then we finished things out by making a quick turntable animation. Everything in the last 4 parts was recorded in one 8-hour sitting. However, this and the next several episodes were recorded over the series of 4 days. I had to take several breaks for reasons that'll become apparent when I get to rigging, so if you want to hear about rigging, don't worry, there'll be plenty of it. As I'm speaking right now, I shit you not, I have 10 hours of unedited footage, all of which includes rigging, so I hope you like rigging. I don't. Anyway, since the last time I recorded, it had been 3 or 4 days since I'd last touched this model, so I had to take a few minutes to reacquaint myself with everything that I did last time. That, and I had to figure out where I was going from this point forward. In the meantime, I did some cleanup. We no longer needed any of these assets in the scene. We only needed them for the turntable in part 4, so pretty much everything except Mina and Whip got deleted. I had kept the handle and moved it to a new collection for future's sake. Once I'd cleared all the unnecessary assets, I had settled on what I was going to be working on. I decided I wanted to clean up and simplify the model's materials. At this point, since I was done texture painting, I no longer needed the highlights or AO layers anymore. So what I could do to optimize this is just to bake the 3 textures together and use the resulting diffuse bake. Funnily enough, I just got done making a tutorial on this subject, so a link to that in the description. Before I bake things down though, I want to adjust the base colors. I felt that the character's fur became too dark during the painting process. So with the fill bucket, I had started hitting areas with fur that I felt got too dark, immediately painted the tail which does not have fur, had to fix that later, and while I was there, I decided I wanted to touch up on the fur texture to make the transition from the furry parts to the fleshy parts look a bit better. I did this to the feet as well, but not before realizing I never actually painted fur texture on the hands. Could have sworn I had painted them prior, but I must have lost them during a crash or something. Not sure, and I'm not checking past parts to find out. Once I touched up the hands and feet, I went on to give the ears a touch up, blending in the areas where the pixels were a bit too harsh around the edges. And while I was saying hello to our old friends the ears, they said hello back in their usual fashion by fucking me. My old arch nemesis still has not given up the mantle of being the biggest pain in my ass since that time I pinched a nerve on the school bus as a child. The UVs were still fucked, and I was seriously in awe that they had continued to hold out like this. At this point, I had had enough of their shenanigans and I was about to fix this problem like Bob the fucking Builder. Instead of trying to figure out what went wrong with the right ear this time and trying to fix the UV islands again, I instead opted to just delete the entire ear and symmetrize the left ear over again to assure that in no way possible could the UVs be fucked this time. Though I did have a brief brain blast when I tried to do this with a mirror modifier before coming to my senses. To take a cut out of the ear, what I did was bevel parts of the ear to get enough edge loops, and then by turning on correct face attributes and keep connected from the options on the sidebar, when I move the edges, it should move and adjust the UVs accordingly to get the correct front and back faces for the ears. And this would have been faster than setting up the boolean, the keyword here being should, and it did not. For some reasons I did not understand, these features were not working at all. After multiple attempts, I simply couldn't get them to work. So on the 3rd attempt of trying to build the right ear with these options enabled, I simply gave up and decided to unwrap it by hand. After a while, I had to check and make sure it wasn't some kind of weird glitch and actually rebooted Blender to see if it fixed it. Spoiler alert, it wasn't a glitch. I was editing a shape key and didn't realize it. With the right ear in place, I now had to reweight it because a symmetrized mesh still keeps the same weight data from the original. Once that was done, the time had finally come to right the wrong that I made in part 3 when I made the mouth UV system. Of the many problems that I have with it, the first one is that the UV and texture are upside down. So it took the texture into GIMP, teased the diffuse bake I made during a test run, and flipped the mouths right side up, then went into the UV editor and flipped them there as well. Now, before I set up the mouth proper, I need to bake the base material down into one singular texture. Well, technically I don't have to, but I'm going to, just to make the material simpler and more efficient. As I already mentioned, I put out a tutorial on the baking process not long ago, and the process is basically going to be the exact same. First, I'm going to separate the eyes and the mouth from the mesh. This is an unnecessary step, but I've removed them from the mesh because at this point, I'm paranoid that something bad might happen. Like, I don't know, having her eyes being baked across her entire body, or vice versa. I added an empty texture node with the correct resolution, and to be doubly sure that Blender wasn't somehow going to affect the eyes or mouth, I deleted the materials from the mesh for the time being. Once everything was clear, I switched into cycles, set the bake mode to diffuse, and ran through the procedure one last time. Made sure I had the model, the texture, and the correct UV selected, and then clicked bake. It did work, however there was a small goof up that didn't happen in my last run. It seems that parts of the cape were baked with the vertex colors and some weren't. So instead of just removing the vertex colors like I should have done and tried again, I instead made a new UV map, removed the inner island of the coat and baked that instead. And with the new baked texture, I saved it as diffuse Mina and replaced all the other color layers with it. With the diffuse layer in place, it was now time to fix the UV maps I'd screwed up in part 3. So I first deleted the shell and began to make the layering system of the base materials with the mouth texture and a mix RGB node. I set the extension mode to clip and fed the alpha into the mix, and for some reason the mouth UVs were upside down again, so I had to go back and flip them, and was quite amused with the resulting face. And the mouth UV warp system was fixed. It was unfortunate that everything was teed up for me in part 3, and I was just too stupid to actually do it right the first time. On a side note, before I tested the UV warp systems, I reparented the UV targets for both the mouth and eyes. They were originally parented to the head, but I felt they would be better suited parented to their respective bases instead. Moving forward, I wanted to try something that I did during a practice run before I started recording. I had managed to isolate what the problem was with the automatic weighting system, and it was the face and eyes. And since they aren't a part of the mesh right now, I wanted to pass them through the automatic weighting so I can get everything in order. I'm not gonna lie, I wasn't really confident in my weight painting skills, so I went ahead and locked all the faces that didn't need weighting and ran it through the automatic weighting, and it didn't work right. It was all kinds of fucky, and I did this several times. You have no idea how frustrating it is that not only just 30 minutes prior to this, it was working just fine, but now that I'm recording, it simply refuses to work. It sometimes makes me question if Blender is self-aware and just wants to hurt me. I gave up trying because my current weights at least worked, and decided I wanted to work on the facial rig now and join the eyes back into the base mesh. Now, I was wanting to set up a system that would allow me to be able to change the textures of the eyes and mouths dynamically so I could have multiple different expressions. However, from past experiences, there have only been two options. Option 1 involved me arranging two new texture atlases, one for the eyes and one for the mouth in GIMP, and making two new UV warp systems to allow me to select the eyes and mouth by moving two new target bones. I felt that doing it this way was just going to make controlling the face harder because it would decentralize the face's controls into 4 separate systems, 2 for controlling the location and the scale of the texture, and 2 for controlling the textures itself. So, yeah, that was a hard no. The second option was equally as unpleasant. Fortunately, I wouldn't have to make a texture atlas. I could just throw all the textures into one folder, and it would involve drivers, which could allow me to control this from the respective target bones, which is a step in the right direction. However, the problem was this system was heavily reliant on a bunch of mix nodes, daisy-chained together, and I had no idea how many textures I was going to make. 2, 4, 10, 20. Every new image texture meant 2 new mix nodes, one to control the alpha and one to control the color data. And to tell Blender which image to display, I have to affect the factor of every single mix node before it. This system is so painfully unscalable even with drivers that just thinking about trying to explain how it works makes me thirsty for the funky flutes that we keep under our bathroom sink. So, since neither option sounded particularly pleasant, I started experimenting with an idea that I've never tried before, or at least never got working before if I had. I made some new folders in the project directory for the textures I was going to use and began organizing, placing the textures into their respective folder. And because I just got done changing the directory for all the textures I was using, I had to go and point Blender to the new folders so I wouldn't get any missing texture errors. I just wanted to start off simple. I wasn't even ready for my own idea just yet. I still needed to do some more textures before I could even try it. So I started by cleaning up the original eye shapes. I wanted them to look more feminine, and there were some random image crusts on the side of the textures I had to get rid of. So I added a little bit of eyeliner here and thinned up the brow, and for some reason all hell started breaking loose. The image crusts returned in unwanted fashion, and I had noticed that there were 2 separate images called text eye. I wanted to delete the duplicate that I wasn't using, and Mina was dorsless about the prospect. For some reason, this completely broke her face even though I made sure to define the new directories, and for some fucking reason there was a clone of Mina hidden underneath Mina. So I tried to kill the imposter, remembered that this was my backup model for when things broke bad, and then just mashed undo until things started making sense. This time when I deleted the redundant image file, nothing bad happened. Tested to make sure that the face rig still worked, and for good measure saved and rebooted Blender to refresh everything and clear any unneeded data blocks. I began running cleanup functions to clear up any data blocks that the reboot didn't get rid of. Ideally, if there were any unnecessary image textures or unused files, this would have thrown them straight into the abyss. This, of course, didn't work, and I had to delete the redundant mouth texture by hand. And then I deleted the other mouth texture, and loaded it in again to be absolutely sure it was the correct one. Now that everything was clean and set in place for the time being, it was time to begin my big experiment to make a facial rig that didn't make me want to die. First I went to the mouth target bone and gave it a custom integer property. I wasn't ready to name it yet just in case it didn't work. Then I went to the mouth texture and made 2 new variants, each with a number drawn on them, just so I can get a kind of an idea if it was actually swapping. Once I had these 3 distinct mouth textures, what I did was I changed the textured node from a single image to an image sequence. I toggled auto refresh so I could display any new changes, and from here I played with the values until the offset slider allowed me to cycle through my textures like so. Everything was working so far, so I went ahead and added 2 new custom properties to the eye target bone, one for the pupils and one for the eye shapes. I then went ahead and converted the eye shapes and pupil nodes into image sequences as well. And there were things that were broken for reasons I didn't yet understood. The pupil display was working, but the eye shapes were not. Somehow, offsetting the eye driver by -1 seemed to have fixed that for the time being, so while everything was in a meta-stable state, I had plans to add more eye textures to test like I did with the mouth system. I got confused for a while trying to navigate the image sequence editor. I then got frustrated, saved a new version of the eye texture as I1 and deleted the old one for some reason. Doing this promptly broke the system for reasons I again didn't yet understand. If you're as confused as I was, that's good, because at this point my brain was fucking melting. I did some more testing, things kept breaking and not displaying the correct texture, or displaying the correct texture incorrectly. I completely lost Mina's eyebrows for a while, and the biggest mystery to me during this whole thing was the value of the offset slider to display the correct texture fluctuated. Sometimes it was -1, sometimes it was 1, and sometimes it was 0, which was completely baffling. I took a break from trying to figure out the system and just decided to paint some new eyes for Mina and solve the problem later. I made what I considered a decent eye texture, cleaned away the magenta I used as a base color just so I could see the plane, and I started doing some tune-ups to make sure that the shape was proper. I took this new eye shape into GIMP and made sure to line it up with the original eye so it wouldn't look weird when the system would work. I even adjusted the eye plane mesh itself to sit on the face better without clipping. Once I saved the texture, I rebooted Blender again because I had become paranoid of Blender screwing me at this point, and started working on the 3rd eye shape, which would become the blink shape. Once I had erased the magenta from the new blink shape, I had realized that shading on the head where the eye sockets were was a terrible idea, so I got rid of them and then went on to finish the blink texture. Now that I have a few separate eye textures, it was finally time to actually sit down and figure out what the hell was going on with the image sequence system and figure out how to fix it. And at this point, I think I was starting to get a suspicion as to why everything was breaking, and things are about to get technical, so hold on to your butts. When I finished the eye textures and saved them, the eye shape drivers were working, even though I had done nothing. The reason why it started working, I suspect, is the fact that all the eye textures shared the same name and they all maintained a numerical sequence at the end of them. Text I1, text I2, and so on. Before I added the numerical sequence to the file names, they would all get stored at the offset value of -1. And I think I get why now. The image sequence node was acting as an array, storing all of the image textures, and the numerical value in their name was to act as an address. The reason why I have been offsetting my custom property by -1 is because the first index in an array isn't 1, it's 0. And because the original textures I tried using didn't have a number in their name at all, they didn't have an address, and because of this they were put at value -1 because Blender didn't know where else to put them. At least, I think. I was at least beginning to understand what was happening after an hour of experimenting. The system was beginning to come together, but there were still some issues I still hadn't yet figured out. For instance, Blender was loading the textures strangely before frame 0, and for the mouth sequence it was playing through all of them up to the 3rd mouth texture and stopping. However, I quickly figured these things out as well after smashing at the system like a caveman. Both of these problems had something to do with the start frame and frames value respectively. Image sequences were designed for many reasons, but one of them being animated textures, in that they had a set amount of frames to play through and a starting point where they would initialize the first frame. Because the starting frame was set to 1, on frame 0 it would load the -1st index of the array, or whatever there was based off the offset value. So to fix that problem, all I had to do was set the starting frame to 0. In actuality, I didn't do that because for rendering purposes the camera would never see frame 0 to render it, though I did eventually fix this off screen, but that's not really that important. As for the mouth, the cycling issue was a result of the frames value. Since image sequences are designed to play animations, the frame values designates how many frames there are to play. Once the current frame hits the starting frame value, it'll from that point on begin to play each sequential frame until it hits the frames value and stop. That is, unless cyclical is enabled, and instead of stopping, it'll just loop. So by setting the frames value to 0, this will ensure that the image sequence will no longer cycle through the image textures unless explicitly done so by me with an offset driver. I felt like a fucking genius figuring this all out alone. I didn't even stop to consider if there was already a tutorial out for this, or if this was even possible at all. Funnily enough, there was a tutorial for this exact same thing, and it was by one of the people that I watched long ago covering UV warp facial rigs. They even ran into the same problem I was having with the image sequence nodes cycling through their textures as well. However, the solution they provided was interesting. Perhaps unfortunate would be a better term. They ended up using drivers to offset the image sequence's animation cycle, using all kinds of different math, and it worked, but the simpler solution was to just set the frames value to 0. Yeah, I've made similar oversights in my tutorials as well. I know the feeling. Once all is said and done, I'll probably also be making a tutorial on this process in a brief and simpler fashion, but I gotta finish this video before that. With the face system now working, I began drawing some new face shapes. I drew a happy mouth shape as well as a neutral mouth shape, and then I realized that the ears had reverted back their texture somehow. In one last hurrah, the ears had the final laugh, which of course I had to fix by smoothing them out again. I don't even plan these sorts of things. Stupid shit just happens like this sporadically. Like, does Blender come with a personal chaos demon task to annoy the user of the software in as many ways as possible? It's ridiculous. By this point, I can make a fucking drinking game for every time the ears break during this series. Anyway, what I was going to do before that happened was I was going to finally give the pupils the glow up that they've been needing. I wanted to make a nice, simple cartoony eye with some color and some highlights, and this was about the only thing that had happened smoothly throughout this entire video, which is honestly kind of impressive. I took the original black lines and filled them in with some brown color, added a darker oval in the center, and added some basic highlights where there should be some glossiness. After I finished painting them out and loading them in, I thought they were a bit dark, so I brought them back, adjusted the color values, and was rather pleased with the results. Now, the final thing that I wanted to cover in this video before I go on to rigging proper was dealing with some of the limitations of the eye controls. As it stood right now, there was two primary issues. The first and currently most pressing is that I can't control the eyes individually. If I needed to adjust one eye for any reason, I wouldn't have the controls to do it. So I needed to break up this one control into smaller ones. So I made two new bones, eye target L and eye target R, and parented them to the center bone, now dubbed the master eye target. This system is going to require two UV warps, one for each eye, and we already have one eye system set up, so we just have to set up the material to allow it to work. So now we need two image sequences, each with their own distinct left and right pupil UV map, and these two textures would be layered together with a mixed RGB node with the alpha of the bottom texture fed into the factor to allow them to exist without overlapping. Once I got the material working, all I had to do was make a duplicate of the eye UV warp system, put the correct UV maps in, and set up the correct bone targets for each one to get them working. And here's where the second issue crops up. There is nothing stopping the pupils from leaving the bounds of the eyes. There's not much, if any, useful case where this would need to happen, so I need to clamp down on this behavior to clean up the function of the eye controller. At first I tried solving the issue using a limit location constraint. Makes sense, right? If I could mathematically define the edges of the eyes with this constraint, then it should solve the problem. And the constraint did exactly that. However, the problem is one of the eyes would hit the outer bounds of their eye before the other one would. So it would just stop in place while the other one kept going. And this was not behavior that I had in mind. I wanted smooth transitions from both pupils as they moved across the eye, so the limit location constraint wasn't going to do it. I was going to have to define the edges of the eyes in a different way, and to do that, I was going to use the transform constraint. Now, the transform constraint is a targeted constraint, and what it can do is it can take the transforms of a target bone and translate it into a different transform in the constrained bone, and map this to a very specific boundary. On the master eye target, I wanted to hard define these bounds with a limit location constraint on the local axis. Half a meter in either direction on the x-axis and about a quarter meter on the y-axis to give it a decent-sized rectangular region. I then copied these boundaries into the map from value of the transform constraint, and then set out to deduce the appropriate values for the map to values by moving the master target to its outer bounds and then pushing the values up until it starts to eclipse the pupil in the eye's boundary. Once I got it working on the left eye, I just copied it over to the right eye and had to flip the min-max values of the x-axis because mirror reflections and whatnot. And with that, I have a rudimentary eye rig in place. I was so happy with this, I had a little bit of fun with the expressions, did the no good, very bad thing, and settled on this face to close out the video. I hope this video was helpful. Be sure to like and subscribe or leave a comment telling me that you like this video. It's one of the only ways that I know that it's worth continuing. If you want to support what I do, you can support me on Ko-Fi or check out any of my other important links down below. But other than that, yeah, that's all I have to say, so see ya.